I want you to picture being called into your store manager's office and told that your register has come up short 11 times in the last 4 months, right before you were scheduled to be promoted, and that the company's own loss prevention manager has recommended your termination. Now picture pulling the store's own transaction void logs yourself, on a hunch, and finding his employee login on every single one of those 11 shortages, logged in after close, after your shift had already ended, after you had already gone home. This is the story of Talia Brennan, and the 11 shortages that turned out to have nothing to do with her at all. Talia Brennan was 26 years old, and she'd worked at Crestline Home Goods, a mid-sized home furnishings retail chain, for just over 4 years, working her way up from part-time cashier to shift supervisor at one of the company's busiest locations. She was good at the job in the way that mattered most in retail, reliable, calm under pressure during a busy weekend rush, and trusted enough by her store manager to be handed increasing responsibility over cash handling procedures and closing shift oversight. The store's loss prevention manager was a man named Vince Kessler, 43, who oversaw shrinkage and cash handling compliance across 3 locations in the region, including Talia's. Vince had broad system access most employees didn't, including the ability to review and, when necessary, personally process transaction voids and refunds outside of normal front register limits, a legitimate tool meant to correct genuine errors like a cashier ringing up the wrong item or a customer changing their mind mid-transaction. Talia's first 3 years, she had no reason to think about Vince's role at all, beyond the occasional interaction during routine cash audits. He had a reputation, among the staff who knew him at all, as thorough and no-nonsense, the kind of loss prevention manager corporate liked precisely because his shrinkage numbers across his 3 stores were consistently better than the regional average, a fact that in hindsight meant something very different than what it appeared to mean on a performance dashboard. It was in her 4th year, right around the time her store manager began discussing her for an assistant store manager promotion, that register discrepancies started appearing on her shifts specifically. Small at first, $40 or $50 short at closeout, the kind of minor variance that happens sometimes in any cash handling business and usually gets written off as counting error. Talia herself assumed, the first 2 or 3 times, that she'd simply miscounted during a busy closing rush and didn't think much of it, but the shortages kept happening, specifically on nights Talia closed, and they kept growing. Over 4 months, 11 separate closing shifts came up short, ranging from $60 to just over $400 on the largest single night, totaling close to $2,000 just for her personally. Though, as she would later discover, similar patterns had quietly been showing up on other closer shifts too, spread out enough that no one else's individual numbers looked as alarming as hers did, concentrated in one person. Vince was the one who flagged the pattern to her store manager, framing it clearly as Talia's problem specifically, since the timing correlated so tightly with her closing shifts. Her store manager, trusting Vince's loss prevention expertise the way store managers generally are trained to, scheduled a formal meeting to discuss cash handling concerns that Talia understood immediately, from the tone of the invite alone, was really about her possible termination. She was understandably frightened and confused going into that meeting, because she knew with complete certainty she hadn't taken a single dollar from her register, ever, in 4 years of employment. But knowing you're innocent and being a Beely led to prove it to 2 people who've already been shown a pattern that points at you are 2 very different problems. In the meeting, Vince presented his findings clinically, 11 shortages, all on her closing shifts, totaling just under $2,000, recommending termination pending final HR review given the company's zero-tolerance cash handling policy. He had printouts, a clean summary sheet, dates lined up neatly in a column, the whole presentation delivered with the calm confidence of someone who had clearly done this kind of review many times before. Talia asked, as calmly as she could manage while her pulse hammered in her ears, whether the actual void and refund logs for those specific nights had been reviewed, since a legitimate correction sometimes explains an apparent shortage that isn't actually theft at all. It was, she would realize only later, close to the only useful question she could have asked in that room, even though at the time she asked it mostly out of instinct rather than any specific suspicion of Vince himself. Vince told her that void logs had been reviewed and showed nothing unusual, and that the pattern simply pointed to unaccounted cash removal during her closing procedure. Her store manager, sitting beside him, nodded along, clearly trusting Vince's stated review completely, rather than feeling any need to independently verify a claim from the person whose entire job was verifying exactly this kind of thing. She was placed on unpaid suspension pending a final decision, which practically meant she had roughly a week before her termination became final, and effectively no income during that week either. That night, unable to sleep, and with nothing left to lose professionally that hadn't already been put at risk, Talia used her own supervisor-level system access, a level below Vince's, but still enough to pull basic transaction history, to look at the void logs herself for the 11 flagged nights. The exact records Vince had told her manager had already been reviewed and showed nothing unusual. What she found was immediate and impossible to misread. On every single one of the 11 nights, there was a void or refund transaction processed after store close, after the register had already been counted down and locked, after Talia herself had already clocked out and gone home, each one processed under a manager-level login that wasn't hers. The amounts of those after-hours voids, transaction by transaction, matched almost exactly the shortage amounts that had been blamed on her. The login on every single one of those after-hours voids belonged to Vince Kessler. She sat with that discovery for a long moment, her fear curdling into something colder and more useful. Vince hadn't found a pattern of her stealing. He had created one, voiding legitimate transactions after the store closed and after she was gone, pocketing the cash difference himself, and then presenting the resulting shortages to her manager as evidence of her theft, all while claiming he'd already reviewed the very logs that actually incriminated him. She understood immediately how dangerous her position still was. She had 1 week, an unpaid suspension already in effect, and evidence that directly contradicted what a loss prevention manager, someone the company implicitly trusted more than a shift supervisor by default, had told her own manager under his professional authority. If she brought this forward clumsily, it would look exactly like a desperate, unprovable counter-accusation from someone about to be fired. So she moved carefully. She printed screenshots of all 11 void transactions, each one clearly time-stamped after her own clock-out time on those nights, each one showing Vince's login credentials, each one matching the dollar amount of her supposed shortage almost to the cent. She cross-referenced her own time clock records for all 11 nights against the void timestamps to remove any possible ambiguity about whether she could have processed them herself before leaving. She requested a meeting not with her own store manager, who she now understood had simply trusted Vince's framing without independently verifying it, but with the regional director of operations, a woman named Carla Whitmore, who oversaw Vince's own role and who Talia had met exactly once before at a regional training session. She sent one message: "I have documentation directly contradicting the loss prevention findings used to justify my suspension. I believe the actual discrepancy originates from a different employee's login, not mine. I'd like to share this before any final termination decision is made." Carla agreed to see her the next morning. Talia laid out the evidence in the clearest possible order, her own time clock records first, establishing she had physically left the building before each void occurred, then the void logs themselves, showing Vince's login time-stamped after her departure on all 11 nights, then the dollar-for-dollar match between the void amounts and her supposed shortages. She was careful about the limits of what she could prove. "I can prove I wasn't in the building when these voids happened. I can prove whose login processed them. I can't prove what he did with the difference after voiding it, only that the shortage blamed on me lines up with money that left through his login, not mine." Carla reviewed the timestamps and login records slowly, cross-checking them herself against the same system Talia had pulled from, and found the match exactly as clean as Talia had described. "This should never have gotten to a termination meeting without someone actually checking this first," she said. "I need you to say nothing further to your store manager or to Vince directly. Give me 48 hours. What happened over those 48 hours moved quickly once someone with real authority was actually looking. Carla pulled Vince's void and refund activity across all 3 stores under his oversight, not just Talia's location, and found a broader pattern. Other employees at the other 2 locations had also faced cash handling scrutiny over the previous 2 years, always following a similar shape, always traced by Vince himself to a specific employee's shift, always with after-hours voids under his own login quietly present in the underlying data that nobody had thought to independently check before accepting his conclusions. The pattern, once corporate asset protection dug into the full 2 years across all 3 locations, showed something particularly damning. Vince had specifically targeted employees who were either up for promotion, like Talia, or who had recently raised unrelated complaints about scheduling or management decisions, apparently because those employees were the easiest to convincingly frame as having a motive worth investigating, and the least likely to be defended reflexively by a store manager who already had some minor friction with them. Across all 3 stores and roughly 2 years, the confirmed total of misappropriated cash traced to Vince's after-hours voids came to just over $85,000. Alongside at least 2 other employees who had been formally disciplined or pushed out over shortages that, in hindsight, appeared to be his doing rather than theirs. Vince Kessler was placed on immediate suspension once the pattern was confirmed, and terminated within the week, with the matter referred to the company's Asset Protection Division and, given the scale involved, to local law enforcement for further action. Talia's suspension was lifted immediately, her record cleared entirely of any cash handling violation, and her promotion to assistant store manager, delayed by the entire ordeal, was finalized within weeks, alongside a formal note in her file, the opposite of the one Vince had tried to create, documenting exactly how her own careful review had uncovered a fraud that had gone undetected across 3 stores for 2 years. Corporate also reached out separately to the 2 other employees whose earlier terminations now appeared connected to the same scheme, reopening their cases for review, given what the broader investigation had uncovered. Some months later, training a new shift supervisor on closing procedures, Talia found herself explaining why the company had introduced a new policy requiring any after-hours void or refund to trigger an automatic email alert to 2 people above the loss prevention role that processed it. Because for 2 years, one person could quietly fix the books after everyone else had gone home and blame whoever's shift it happened to look like, she said. Nobody thought to check whether the person investigating the shortage might be the one causing it. Now, nobody has that kind of unsupervised authority over anyone else's blame. The new supervisor asked, understandably, how Talia had found the courage to push back on a loss prevention manager's findings while she was already suspended and facing termination. I wasn't brave exactly, Talia said. I just knew I hadn't done what he said I'd done, and I figured the system that supposedly proved it had to leave some kind of trail somewhere. I was right that it did. I was lucky it pointed so clearly at him instead of just staying ambiguous. If you've ever been accused of something you know for certain you didn't do, by someone whose word the company trusted automatically more than yours, don't just accept the accusation because their title outranks your evidence. Pull the actual records yourself if you can. The truth usually leaves a timestamp somewhere, even when someone's counting on nobody checking. Keep your file. Keep your receipts. Somebody's login is always sitting right there in the data, waiting for someone patient enough to look.